Okay, so the red dot's on, we're recording. Okay, so we're we're starting our Bible class for the second Sunday of Lent. And first, we're going to look at the first reading, and Carrie Malone is going to read the Missal translation for us. And while she's reading, if you'll jot down any words, phrases, or images that come to you as you're listening to Carrie read. Okay, all yours, Carrie.
A reading from the book of Genesis. God put Abraham to the test. He called to him, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son Isaac, your only one, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There you shall offer him up as a holocaust on a height that I will point out to you. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Then he reached out and took a knife to slaughter his son. But the Lord's messenger called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he answered. Do not lay your hand on the boy, said the messenger. Do not do the least thing to him. I know now how devoted you are to God, since you did not withhold from me your own beloved son. As Abraham looked around, he spied a ram caught by his horns in a thicket. So he went and took the ram and offered it up as a holocaust in place of his son. Again, the Lord's messenger called to Abraham from heaven and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you acted as you did in not withholding from me your beloved son, I will bless you abundantly and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants shall take possession of the gates of their enemies, and your descendants, all the nations of the earth, shall find blessing. All this because you obeyed my command, the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Okay, so now if anyone, be sure to unmute yourself and let us know any words or phrases or images that struck you while Mr. Malone was reading.
Father, this is Pat Flowers. Go ahead, I'll wait.
I saw the word test and holocaust.
Test and holocaust. Okay.
Father, I had the image of Isaac being on the altar, and then also the image, the depictions that I have seen of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. It seems like in many of the pictures, he was elevated up on some type of rock. So I had the image of Jesus being on an altar in the Garden of Gethsemane.
I see. Okay. Any other images or phrases or words that struck people?
How about I will make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky?
As descendants, as countless as the stars of the sky. Okay.
I swear by myself.
I swear by myself. Okay. Hey, Brother Mike.
Your son Isaac, your only one.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll start giving us a little bit of background. This comes from what scholars call the Elohist tradition. It's a tradition put into writing in the Northern Kingdom. Of course, it has legends that were told by word of mouth for centuries, but it was put into writing in the Northern Kingdom in the 800s, a little after the time of Solomon. That is, it's a little bit after the time after the Civil War, which divided God's people from 12 tribes of Israel into the Northern Kingdom of 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom of Judah and Benjamin. In contrast to the J tradition, and like the later P tradition, the E tradition refers to God not as Yahweh, the Lord, but as Elohim. After the Assyrians conquered the north in 722 BC, some northern scribes managed to flee to the south, and they brought their traditions with them. And ultimately, these traditions became incorporated into the traditions of Judah, the southern kingdom, and eventually into our Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. The northern tradition puts more emphasis on God's activity through prophets than through the house of David. As a matter of fact, the whole Civil War took place because the northern tribes were sick and tired of the way that the house of David under Solomon had been governing them. So the northern tradition is not nearly so praising of the house of David as the southern tradition. Put Abraham to the test. Now, test or put to the test or tempt, all of these translate the Hebrew verb nisa. Gerhard von Rad, in his commentary on Genesis, calls this section the Great Temptation. The Greek Old Testament rendered the Hebrew by the word peirazo, and peirazo means to tempt. In Mark's gospel, this is what Satan does to Jesus. That's the gospel that we just had on the first Sunday of Lent. And sometimes the pious will make a distinction. Well, God tests you, but Satan tempts you. Well, that's a distinction that we make in English that you don't make either in Hebrew or in Greek. It feels the same when you're going through it. And at the time that Abraham was experiencing it, he did not know whether this was a temptation from some evil spirit or a test from the true God. He had to believe that it was God. But when it says God tested Abraham, that's the editorial comment of the editor who put the story down in writing centuries after the time of Abraham. The related noun, peirasmos, test or temptation, this appears in the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into temptation, or some translations say, do not put us to the test. And in effect, Jesus teaches us to pray, don't give us a temptation like the one you gave Abraham. Don't give us a test like that. We're not as good as he was. What is omitted? Verses 3 to 9, except for 9a. And so the story of the journey of the place to the place of sacrifice. And here's what's omitted. I think I'm giving you the RSV. Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey. Now, this is the NABRE, I'm pretty sure. Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac, and after cutting the wood for the burnt offering, set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham caught sight of the place from a distance. Abraham said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey, while the boy and I go over there. We will worship and then come back to you." So Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two walked on together, Isaac spoke to his father Abraham. "Father," he said. "Here I am," he replied. These are the exact words that Abraham said to God in 22 verse 1. Abraham, "Here I am." Isaac continued, "Here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "My son, God will provide the sheep for the burnt offering." Then the two walked on together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, and this verse is in the missal, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he bound his son Isaac and put him on top of the wood on the altar. So what's the force of this omission? When we get to our comments and observations, feel free to jump right in. For one thing, omitting the second part of verse 9 omits the reference to Abraham binding Isaac, tying him up. Jews call this passage the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. They don't call it the sacrifice of Isaac because Isaac isn't actually sacrificed. Commenting concerning this aspect of the story, the Catholic scholar Bruce Votter asked, "Are we to think of Isaac as pleading against this unsuspected fate, or as numbly acquiescing to the actions of his suddenly unnatural father? And what of future feelings, even though Abraham's hand was stayed at the end?" And a Jewish rabbi once pointed out to me that the Bible never records Isaac speaking to his father again after this verse. To none of these questions does the biblical author answer. His attention is riveted on the sole issue of Abraham's faith in God's promise, which stood the ultimate test of willing compliance with an awful command of obedience. Notice in verse 12, "Now I know." The storyteller's God does not know everything. He needs to find out by testing Abraham. The storyteller's God does not know in advance how the test is going to turn out. How different this is from the God of the theologians, the God who knows everything. How different this is from the God we learn about in our catechism. Sometimes this is what makes it hard for us to understand the Bible, because we've learned so much about the storyteller. We've learned so much about the theologian's God, we really don't appreciate the storyteller's God. Here is verse 14 omitted, and I give you a little bit of context. "So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son." Here's 14. "Abraham named that place Yahweh Yireh. Hence people say today, on the mountain, the Lord will see, or the Lord will provide." And then a second time, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven. So let's see. I'll just comment. Notice the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh appears, and I give you a footnote on that. Most scholars think that that is a secondary, later addition to the story of the Elohist. Okay, so at this point, any questions or comments or observations?
Father Pat,
Yes.
Today Muslims look back to Father Abraham and consider him their ancestor. Do they have a story like this, or maybe this story in their history, where God was going to sacrifice a son?
uh, actually, I don't know the Quran that well, so I would have to look to see. But and I'm just going to ignore that phone ringing because it's uh, so. So I don't know if, but I do know that Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we're all Abrahamic religions. We all regard ourselves as children of Abraham, but they trace their descent to Ishmael, uh, uh, and what their tradition about Abraham having to sacrifice his son, I honestly don't know. But thank you for that question. I might start looking in my Quran to see.
Well, along those same lines, I noticed that God told him to take his son Isaac, his only one. So the storyteller acts like Isaac is the only boy Abraham had.
Right. That's a good point. Actually, Abraham does have another son, but at this part in the story, he's the only one left because in the previous chapter, chapter 21, and I had forgotten this myself, so thank you for raising it. At the insistence of the jealous Sarah, Abraham has driven away his slave girl Hagar along with the son Ishmael. So they have been driven out. And so at this point, Isaac is the only one that Abraham has with him. But you make an excellent question. Yeah. Okay, well, let's move right along. And who was going? Pat, you're going to read the text for us, I think from the NABRE this time. And if you want to go through 1 to 18, that's fine, or 1 to 2 and 9 to 18, that would be good. And you can just leave out, don't worry about cutting verse 9 in half.
Okay, well, I'll start with verse 10 and just read straight through to 19.
Okay.
I kept faith even when I said I am
No,
great.
not the psalm, the first reading. Genesis.
When is that?
I thought I had Genesis 22. Genesis 22, and you'll want to read verses 9 to 18.
Okay.
Well, why don't you read 1 to 2 and then 9 to 18?
Okay.
Okay.
Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test and said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son Isaac, your only one, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you.
And then verse 9 to 18.
When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged wood on it. Next, he bound his son Isaac and put him on top of the wood on the altar. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he answered. Do not lay your hand on the boy, said the angel. Do not do the least thing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you did not withhold from me your son, your only one. Abraham looked up and saw a single ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named that place Yahweh Yireh,
There you are. Where'd you go?
Cheryl H., you need to mute yourself. Keep reading, Pat.
Okay. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering. Abraham named that place Yahweh Yireh. Hence, people today say, on the mountain of the Lord will provide. A second time, the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven and said, I swear by my very self, oracle of the Lord, that because you acted as you did, in not withholding from me your son, your only one, I will bless you and make your descendants as countless as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the gates of their enemies, and in your descendants all the nations of the earth will find blessing, because you obeyed my command.
Okay, so now we can all unmute if we want to. And what is the good news that we hear as we hear this passage? What was the good news for those who heard this story when the ink was wet? And what's the good news for us today?
God is good, and if you follow him, he'll take care of you.
Okay. Any other good news there?
Father, I think it is
I will bless you abundantly.
Bless you abundantly. Okay, that was good news, and the blessing goes to the descendants, and those hearing it, they would realize that when the ink was wet, that this applied to them. Sometimes we forget what Pope Pius XII said, spiritually, we're all Semites. Spiritually, we're all children of Abraham. So yes, that's good news.
I think the good news is that we can trust him to take care of us and do what's best for us.
Okay.
Trust in the Lord.
If I may build on that, Margie, the one that keeps striking me is that trusting God doesn't always make sense. Trusting God seems odd, but yet when we do, the benefits are great. But it's not an easy task to trust God. So I think that's a reminder for us that this isn't easy. This isn't clear cut.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't make sense to us to trust in God, because you say, well, why did you let this happen?
Yeah.
Or why is this happening? We have to trust in him.
Okay, and Mike and Margie are leading us into the next part, which this is actually somewhat of a challenge. So what are some other challenges that the people are hearing here?
Father, go ahead.
Hey. Hold on.
Okay, 318-455-1818. You need to mute if you're not gonna. Okay, Mary Ellen, come on in.
Okay, Father, I have read somewhere, and I'm looking, you've got me going, Pat has me going, because I read somewhere, and the point was made was why was the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Quran, as well as, in all three major monotheistic religions. And I'm looking, but right now I'm in Karen Armstrong's book on Islam, and I know I read it somewhere.
Okay, well that would be a good place to find it if it's in there. You can probably look up Isaac in the index.
Father?
Yes, Margie.
I Googled it on my iPad
Ah,
The Quran says that it was Ishmael that went with Abraham up to the altar and that he was in agreement. They say that he agreed to everything.
okay.
He was willing to be sacrificed.
Was willing to be sacrificed. And
But it wasn't Isaac, it was Ishmael,
Ishmael.
according to the Quran.
Now, also, there's a later post-biblical Jewish tradition that pictures Isaac not as a little boy, but as a strapping young man who easily could have resisted his father, Abraham. But according to the Jewish tradition, Isaac willingly allowed himself to be bound. So that's a similarity there between Islam and Judaism. The son willingly allows himself to be bound, and later fathers of the church before Islam, they had the tradition also of a willing Isaac.
Father, as far as the first part of that, where you said that he's seen as a young man rather than a child, he'd almost have to be. You know, if you go back and look at it, it says Abraham gave him the wood to carry for 3 days.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
You know, that gets heavy, especially if it's for a kid. It'd have to be almost a full-grown man.
Uh-huh. There you go. A reasonable deduction. That's probably how the Jewish tradition came to that. Great insight. Okay, let's see. So I'm gonna go ahead and end this. So I'm gonna stop the recording.